Order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equality Select Committee. Today we're holding an oral evidence session on egg donation and egg freezing. We will hear first, we've got two panels from Helen Gibson, founder of Surrogacy Concern, and Zeynep Gurtin, lecturer in women's health at UCL. Welcome to you both and thank you so much for coming. We've already had one session and that has been fascinating in itself, and we're really looking forward to hearing from your expertise and also from panel two's expertise as well. So I'm going to hand straight over to Dame Nia.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for coming in. We thought we'd start off with any concerns about egg donation in general. So really, does the regulation that we have in the UK adequately protect the health and well-being of people who donate or freeze their eggs? So we both want to come in on that.
So we have, as you know from our submission, significant concerns around egg donation per se because of the culture we think it's giving rise to in society, where women's eggs come to be seen as something people have access to and come to be seen as a resource, as well as a sort of globally traded commodity, which we think is very concerning when we're talking about human tissue and the fact that fertilised eggs will hopefully go on to become a donor-conceived person with rights and feelings of their own. So there is that wider issue which sits above all of this, but within that, within the framework that surrounds egg donation as it works in the UK today, we have other significant concerns from a safeguarding point of view. So as we've said in our written submission, we've got concerns that the minimum age for donors is too low. We've got huge concerns about payments and the fact that they may incentivise women, or do incentivise women in our view, to donate their eggs out of financial need or out of an incentive to get cheaper egg freezing or cheaper IVF. We're very concerned that counselling is not mandatory. You must offer counselling, but it's not mandatory to take up, and we think that that's a mistake. There's no requirement for a cooling off period either after counselling. And there's inconsistency in the regulations where on adverts they're not meant to highlight financial gain, but they do consistently highlight the so-called compensation, £985 in big letters on a lot of ads, not just the ones that have recently been banned by the ASA, but many others. And we think that that provides a real incentive on the marketing to women to come forward. There is not long-term tracking of egg donors' data after they've donated. They're not followed up with over the months and years by clinics, and the HFEA aren't gathering that data bar incidences of severe and critical OHSS as well. So there's a huge job of work there, and there's other inconsistencies as well, and we're looking at the UK system, and we'd previously thought that there was a 10 cycle limit for donation in the UK. That was our view, and that had been informed by various articles and references we'd seen. Actually, looking again recently, ahead of coming to the committee, I couldn't find reference to that 10 cycle limit, which is concerning when you consider how harmful it could be to undergo multiple donation cycles. And interestingly, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, and obviously in America, egg donation is much more of a free-for-all. They recommend no more than 6 donation cycles, and they say oocyte donors should be limited to 6 treatment cycles per donor. The basis for this recommendation is rooted in concern over the cumulative risk for the donor after undergoing more than 6 ovarian stimulation and oocyte retrieval procedures. Here we don't have one. Now, I know in their evidence, the HFEA said very few women ever went through more than 5 cycles, but if that's the case, perhaps it would be good to have a hard ceiling on the numbers of donation cycles just to better protect women's health, given that we know a lot about the short-term harms to women's bodies from egg retrieval, whether it's for freezing your own IVF or donation, but the long-term risks are really quite unknown, and we are very worried about that indeed. So we would like to see that tracking, and we would like to see fertility clinics being mandated to report long-term outcomes to the HFEA, who must report it to DHSC. But we do have concerns, and we have written to the DHSC on more than one occasion about this, that they're not taking their duty to women seriously enough. especially when we consider these are incredibly young women, and they're always going to be young women because it has to be young women if you're doing egg donation. It can't be older women. I myself am too old to be asked for my eggs. We think that they are being negligent. They didn't undertake an impact assessment before they allowed payments to rise for egg donors in October 2024. They should have done, and they've not commissioned or seen research themselves to say that egg donation or egg retrieval is safe in the long term. So we're very worried about the long-term impact of, if women do come forward, beyond the ones that we've picked up on to say they regret it or they've been harmed in future years, they may say, why didn't the state protect me from private sector fertility clinics and egg banks preying on me through adverts for my eggs when I was just 18 years of age? And they will be held accountable for that, we think.
Right. So perhaps if I'll come to Zeynep in a moment, but if I could just follow up on something you touched upon, and that's the issue about reporting. I mean, you mentioned this slightly. Perhaps you could just elaborate whether you feel there are regulatory gaps that lead to under-reporting or inconsistent reporting of problems.
Yes, absolutely. So, as I said, there's no follow-up with donors legally required. It should be part of mandatory reporting. I think, according to the HFEA dashboard, there have been 24,825 donors in the UK since 1991. Those donors' details or last known addresses should be held by the HFEA for the donor register. We would ask whether or not retrospectively going and trying to gather information from those donors might be something that they could do in order to start this cohort study that we think needs to happen, looking at women who've undergone egg retrieval, at least for donation, versus women who haven't, of similar profiles, to see if there's any emerging patterns in harm. We think all cases of OHSS, not just severe and critical, should be reported to the HFEA. The RCOG, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, in their earlier leaflet on OHSS said something like a third of all women under 30 will get OHSS. We'd like to see how many are actually presenting with that if clinics are capturing it. So that should be reported. And we think there should be this mandatory set of guidelines for clinics in terms of their obligations to women undergoing egg donation or egg sharing, which should form part of the inspection regime of clinics, and that should include some of the things that we have talked about just now. There also needs to be, in our view, capturing of other health complications, because there are lots of short-term complications that happen in the immediate aftermath beyond OHSS, so we shouldn't just look at this through the prism of OHSS, and I can come on to that later. We should also be looking at this. And finally, on capturing information, I'd be very interested to see more information about people who are buying eggs in terms of their age and sex and income brackets. So I think the HFEA look at patient cycles where donor gametes are used, which would imply people who have obtained donor gametes. But I think the age limit on that tops out at about 44. Now, we think lots of older people than 44 are now starting to buy donor gametes in ever-increasing number. We would quite like to know who those people are who are buying donor eggs. And, you know, as far as we're aware, the fertility sector is set to be worth 1.1 billion to the UK economy by 2030. We'd be very interested to know how much of that is coming from the sale of women's eggs.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps if I could turn that to Zeynep, and really to start on your views on the same issues about whether here in the UK we are adequately protecting the health and well-being of people who donate their eggs, and whether there are any gaps in the reporting or under-reporting that you know of.
Thank you very much. So here in the UK, our fertility sector is overall very good. It's very well regulated, and generally, world over, it's considered to be one of the best and a gold standard. Now, having said that, our regulation, the Act, the HFE Act, which underpins the obligations of the HFEA, was set in 1990. And the sector has changed considerably since then. So is there room for improvement? Absolutely. Have there been changes to the sector that could not have been foreseen in 1990, absolutely. And the HFEA themselves have obviously made calls for regulatory change. I think there is a slight danger, and I will make my own interest very clear here. I do sit on the HFEA committee, so you can filter out my bias as you wish. But the reason I sit on the HFEA committee is because I have always really admired the HFEA as well. I do think there is a slight danger that the HFEA works so well that the need for regulatory change and updating might not appear to be as necessary as we in the HFEA believe it is, and I can outline some of the places and reasons for why. Broadly speaking, we can talk about the fertility sector changing hugely since 1990, both in terms of who is receiving treatment. So increasingly we're seeing same-sex couples, we're seeing single women, but also in terms of how treatment is provided to patients. So we're no longer talking about fertility clinics solely as sort of bricks and mortar buildings, which the HFE Act is designed to regulate, but we're also talking about online providers, online advertising. We're talking about an industry that's becoming more and more within the private sector. So all of those things suggest that there is, important room for improvement. At the moment, the HFEA has no oversight over the commercial or financial aspects of fertility treatment. And although they've worked sort of very successfully with the CMA and the ASA with regards to issues like advertising, it would obviously be much more seamless if those things would be brought under the remit of the HFEA, who is, in this sector all the time. Also, the tools that are available to the HFEA at the moment are quite blunt. So yes, the HFEA can revoke the license of a clinic if they believe that clinic has not complied with license conditions. But the tools available to them are not very flexible. So unlike other regulators, for example, Ofcom, that has system of being able to levy fines, the HFEA has no such powers. And you can imagine that powers like that could be used quite effectively in the case of issues of non-compliance that are not serious enough to warrant closing a clinic and risking disrupting the treatment of thousands of patients, but might be important to, send that message of penalties, or in the case of inappropriate advertising or non-reporting of short-term harms or adverse incidents or something like that. So that's kind of the broad overall picture. We're talking about a huge number of cycles that take place in the UK. So 2023, which is the last year we have on record, it was 77,500 cycles of fertility treatment, which is a huge number. Most of those cycles were safe. Most of those patients were very satisfied. Again, is there room for improvement? I would argue, yes, there is. The number of cycles involving donor eggs and egg freezing is very small within that overall number. So the number of egg freezing, which is my area of expertise more, it was 6,700 cycles of that 77,500 that were egg freezing. So we are seeing actually a disproportionate coverage of egg freezing in the media, for example. The number of column inches that egg freezing takes up is disproportionate compared to how much the practice actually is. But, we could think about that being interesting in terms of where we might go or the kinds of potentials. There is, I think, Helen and I agree in some respects, there is some evidence to suggest that although the risks and harms are generally very well controlled within the fertility sector, that there may be some underreporting. And I've been particularly interested in regards to egg freezing for that. And there's some new research that's just been submitted for publication with the BMJ. I believe it's been emailed to the committee from UCLH that suggests that there are higher numbers of women suffering from short-term adverse impacts than are being reported. In some years, the number of women admitted to UCLH were actually higher than the numbers reported nationally to the regulator. So there does seem to be a bit of a mismatch there. And certainly, I think aftercare is an area where we can talk about, clinics having more responsibility. To move on to the more sort of longer term impacts, I think that's a really important question, and it's an interesting question. Is it the HFEA's role? I'm not sure. I don't know how, as a sociological researcher, I don't know how appropriate I would feel it is to retrospectively contact people and disturb them in the middle of their life X number of years later if they had not given consent to that. However, that's not to say that follow-up can't happen. And I'm currently part of a funding bid. This kind of research usually happens by science and social science researchers. I'm currently part of a bid that's been submitted for funding to the Wellcome Trust for a longitudinal follow-up of long-term effects that would combine HFEA data with NHS data, so would be able to track everybody who'd been through fertility treatment, egg donation, egg freezing. And that would not only look at people who've had fertility treatment, but also look at the children of people who've had fertility treatment and the children of the children. So a three generation. But, what's needed for that is the will and the funding to make that kind of thing available. I think that's more appropriately the role of perhaps researchers than the HFEA. Certainly at the moment, it's not within the HFEA's regulatory remit.
Perhaps return to the
just 1 second. I just want to point out we will have votes probably in the next 20 minutes, but also that we're still on question 1, and we probably have about 12 questions to get through for just this panel alone. I'll hand over to Dame Nia.
Yes, so really, I mean, you've talked about the general, effects. Perhaps we could just return very specifically to any current research now on the long-term health effects. Is there anything specific that you're aware of now, or?
So the long-term data we currently have, and you could look at some of the work that's done by Alistair Sutcliffe at UCL. He's sort of the person in the UK that's really looked at that work. Doesn't suggest adverse health effects for IVF patients. In general, it suggests it's a safe treatment.
Can I answer that briefly? Is that all right?
Yeah, I'll come back to you in half a sec. We just follow up about the people who donate or freeze their eggs. I mean, should the HEFA mandate some sort of follow-up? You're saying you don't think it's their role, is that right?
Well, it depends what kind of follow-up we're talking about. So the HFEA only does what is within its regulatory remit, right? They can't sort of decide they want to do X, Y, and Z. So if the regulatory framework is changed to require those sorts of things, of course the HFEA can implement that recommendation. That's ultimately up to Parliament. I certainly think it would be appropriate to require better aftercare from clinics. And, that could be in the form of a follow-up appointment 1 month later or something like that that's documented and data is provided. What I don't think would be easy or really feasible is to contact people years later when they've not necessarily given consent for that.
So really it should be specifically to any immediate health impacts, is what you're saying? Yeah.
Would be, yes.
Okay. Right, so if I can come back to Helen, who probably wants to come in on that, but also perhaps pick up on something you said earlier. We understand that the HFEA report says there's been no cases of severe OHSS in egg donors reported in the clinics in 24-25, but you were talking about a third. So perhaps you could just touch on the two issues there.
So the third is meant to be a third of women under 30 might suffer mild symptoms of OHSS, whereas the severe and critical is expected to be more about 1 to 2%. But we haven't been massively comforted by the fact that of the 67 severe and critical incidents last year, none were apparently to do with donors, because firstly that's still severe and critical for other women maybe undergoing IVF or egg freezing, whatever their reason for egg retrieval is. And as we said, we think all of the cases of OHSS need to be captured. One donor reported experienced horrific pain to us, and that wouldn't have come up in the HFE data, but it doesn't mean that that's not a severe incident to that individual woman as well. And I understand there was an increase last year, reported to the HFEA from clinics, of incidents. Now, that was 792 incidents reported to the HFEA, 36% more than the 581 the year before. Now, that covers all manner of things. That covers problems going wrong in the laboratory, that covers administrative protocols. That's not just about clinical harm to individual women, but it's important to note that these harms and incidents are taking place in the clinics where egg donation is governed and managed. So that's just sort of a context to be aware of.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Danielle. Rachel.
Thank you. I'll come to you first, Helen. Do you think that the current compensation limit strikes the right balance between compensating women for their time and expenses, but at the same time avoiding financial inducement?
Not at all. You'll be unsurprised to know that we think the word compensation is simply a case of semantics. It's a euphemism. It is payment. You get paid £985 in 1 or 2 instalments flat into your bank account after retrieval. I think if you went outside and spoke to somebody in the street and said, I'm going to give you something in exchange for doing something else, I'm going to give you money in your bank account, but it's not a payment, they'd be quite surprised by the fact that you're saying that. So I've never been convinced by the argument that it is compensation. We think that the amount that is offered seriously incentivises low-income and working-class women to donate when they would not otherwise choose to do so. I have evidence here of women doing that for that reason. We think all payments should be banned. If it is as altruistic as the HFEA and some academics with rather small studies tend to say it is, then let's see how many women come forward and do it altruistically without the incentive that a large, nearly £1,000 payment provides. Our view is that payments should be banned, and if that's not forthcoming, we should revert to an expenses-only system of itemised expenses in exchange for train tickets, etc. I don't agree with previous witnesses who you've seen who said, but that was so arduous. Nowadays, we'll have train tickets in our emails. They can be easily produced. Filling in a form cannot be seen as arduous when you're asking, on the other hand, for women to go through at least 2 weeks of clinic visits multiple times, scans, and then undergoing all those artificial hormone injections, and then injection through your vaginal wall into your ovary. How is that supposedly, expenses is arduous, but this isn't? I mean, I think that's a ludicrous, inconsistent argument again within the sector. £985 is a very significant sum of money to a low-income working-class woman in a precarious part-time job. We all need to be aware of the financial context in which egg donation sits, which is that we have had austerity, cost of living crisis, pandemic, recession, low wage growth, stagnant pay for 15 years in this country. The idea, and I know some witnesses said it, that £985 is not a lot of money, is deeply insulting and untrue. And I'm sure in many of your constituencies you have areas of high deprivation where you know full well there are women who would see an ad, shiny, happy young women going out on a night out, £985 in massive letters, and on those adverts it doesn't say a syllable about the health risks, short or long term, of egg retrieval. We know there are women who would do that thinking, there's no harm. If there was harm, the government would do something about it. So I don't buy compensation. It needs to be totally overhauled.
Thank you. And just going on from that, do you think, therefore, why do you think the minimum age should be raised to 25?
So we said that for very specific reasons, not least because if you look at the numbers of very young women, I think it was something like 5,894 women between the years of 1991 to 2022 donated between the ages of 18 to 25. We are very concerned that the sharpest end of this, it is the youngest women who are at most risk of financial exploitation. So if you start off at the age of 18, you're targeting women who are maybe still in school or at college or going off to university, or if they're in work, it's probably quite low-paid work or apprenticeships which aren't paid that well at the age of 18. They're going to be at the highest risk for financial motivation, inducement, and indeed exploitation.
Can I just ask, are there any other comparable sort of countries or areas where they have changed that age limit?
I don't know about comparable countries on age limit. I mean, in Germany, there is no egg donation at all. It's not allowed at all. In Italy, donors cannot be compensated. What I would say is there is precedence here in this country for some in the private sector actually say, to donate eggs, you should be 21. So I'm not a fan of the London Egg Bank, but on their adverts, they say 21 to 35. And there's another clinic in Glasgow where they say an age of 19. So within the private sector, there is already this precedence. But what we would say is that you've got a real mismatch here in public policy. So if a woman goes to the GP in her 20s and says, I know I definitely don't want children, I want to be sterilised, the GP will tell her to go away and come back when she's older and she's thought about it a bit more. Now, I make no judgment on that, and it's quite a paternalistic situation. However, it is one where the doctors are saying, wait until you're nearly 30. Whereas at the other extreme, you can have eggs retrieved to benefit somebody else, not you, but somebody probably twice your age's fertility treatment, probably got a lot more social and economic capital than you have, and they can take those eggs and you're only at the age of 18. That's a real mismatch in public policy, and we don't think that that is right at all. And so that's why we settled on the age of 25. And on the egg sharing point, which does incentivise some women to donate in order to get the cheaper IVF or the cheaper egg freezing, Lord Winston, who sits in the House of Lords and is a pioneer of fertility treatment, has said that in his own clinic he has seen women who egg shared. He said this in a debate in the Lords in 2008. Women who are not wealthy and are perhaps somewhat dispossessed and have to pay for their in vitro fertilisation treatment opt to donate some eggs from the clutch of eggs taken during IVF, in return for which they get free treatment. Rightly or wrongly, the HFEA has consistently sanctioned egg sharing of that sort. I'm not sure that is a wise decision. Women often go into such arrangements through desperation. Having met a number of these women after treatment, I can vouchsafe for the serious predicament that they find themselves in after egg sharing arrangements when they deeply regret having gone through it. Now, younger women are coming forward to egg freeze as well, so that's an incentive that they have. And as well as the fact that younger women are being targeted with these 985 payments. If you didn't have the 985 payments, I think there would be stronger argument for not raising the minimum age, but while you have the payments, you really need to.
Thank you. Zeynep, do you think there's any further safeguards that could protect these women more effectively?
Yeah, and if I may just talk on the 985 figure, I'm of a different opinion. I believe that it is really important to compensate women who donate. It's not the central question is not here whether the figure of 985 in abstract is high or low or a lot. It's what is it in response to what's required to donate eggs, which is usually several weeks, several trips to the clinic. And I do think it's appropriate to make sure that women are not ending up out of pocket and are not being treated in a sort of suspicious manner where they're having to provide every single receipt. I think, the discussions that led to the setting of those figures, I think, were appropriate to set a good balance between providing decent compensation and not incentivizing. But I think there's also a sort of a slightly larger, kind of more theoretical or ideological point, because if you adopt the attitude that women, because they're women or because they're between 18 and 25 or because they're talking about reproductive issues, are vulnerable, then it's very difficult, regardless of what piece of social science research evidence you provide, saying actually women overall feel they have consented to this, they are happy with this, they're satisfied with this. It's very difficult to, persuade you otherwise if you're of an ideological position that women are vulnerable and need protecting. I think I agree that 18-year-olds are not really the best people to be donating eggs, and the HFEA data shows they're not the predominant people donating eggs. The average age is 30. Overall, we have very good evidence to suggest that people who are going through with egg donation are making that, and egg freezing, are making those decisions with their own autonomy. Could we make the system even more robust? Could we provide more regulation around advertising? Yes, absolutely. But I think in general, thinking about women as vulnerable or desperate is also very patronising, and I would actually be more concerned about the implications of withholding reproductive choices and rights from adult women who we generally feel are able to make decisions if they received, if they receive good information than otherwise. So for me, the onus really has to be on making sure that the clinics are providing good information. Again, an area of regulatory reform that the HFEA has called for is currently clinics are required to offer counselling to people going through egg donation, for example. We would prefer that to be mandated, mandate that people have to have counselling. And I think, that's, for example, another appropriate check to ensure that everybody has enough time to think through these things.
Thank you, Rachel.
Did you want to carry? Yeah, I can do. Yeah, and just continuing with you, Zeynep, on the research sort of area. We were obviously hoping to be joined by Laura Rose today on this panel as well, and these questions were going to be sort of directed towards her. But do you think there is sufficient research and data collection on LGBT plus people who donate or freeze their eggs? And is there more that needs to be done there? Are they being exploited?
I don't know if they're being exploited. We don't have any, robust evidence to show that anyone is necessarily being exploited. I think, of course, in all of these areas, there is room for more research, and I'm sure everybody would welcome that. I think one of the, if we're talking about things like egg sharing, and I believe that Laura Rose, in her written evidence, was talking about the case that some same-sex couples might be egg sharing more. Again, if we're concerned about something like egg sharing, I think our greatest safeguard against something like that, if we have concerns, would be to increase NHS funding so that people are able to access the fertility treatment they so want to have the children that they desire. At the moment, there is almost no funding available through the NHS for same-sex couples or single women, and that's obviously very unfair.
Yeah.
I just want to say very briefly, we can't speak for Laura Rose, obviously it wouldn't be appropriate to do so, she's not here, but something I wanted to say is that there are, as I've put in the written evidence, significant studies now that show that pregnancies with donor eggs are higher risk pregnancies, and for women undergoing reciprocal IVF, lesbian women, that's an increasing option to them, and we know more lesbian women are undergoing reciprocal IVF. Now, I don't know, and I certainly don't think it's mandatory, that if you undergo pregnancy with a donor egg, gestational surrogacy, or reciprocal IVF, all of which have the same, it's the same process, I don't think clinics are advising those women that those pregnancies are higher risk, and I think they should be mandated to do so, which would go some way, again, on the informed consent point, to better inform women so they can make a free and informed choice that if you go down that road, you may be at higher risk of some severe pregnancy complications.
I would certainly agree with that as well. Yeah, and risk management is something we all do all the time in our daily lives, and fertility treatment is no different. So if you let women know that they're at a small increased risk of preeclampsia, for example, from using donor eggs, it may be that they choose to take that risk anyway, but certainly they should be informed about it.
Which I don't think they are at the moment.
Thank you, Rachel. Zeynep, I just wanted to come back on something you said, that 18-year-olds are not your predominantly preferred candidates for egg donation, and that they're not the largest number. What is the trend in the numbers and the demographics in terms of the age groups of people donating their eggs? What's the trend?
For egg donation, I think I could send you that. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but the HFEA certainly does keep track of all of those numbers.
Perfect, thank you. And I also just wanted to raise the issue about people not doing this because they need the money, which is what we heard in our previous sessions. And actually, all of us around this table will know that women have found it incredibly difficult over the last 10 years in particular. But I wondered what data you had and what kind of evidence and surveys you have done to really dig down as to people's motivations for donating eggs. Now, a few months ago, Good Morning Britain surveyed women aged 18 to 25 and found that almost 40% would consider donating their eggs, and of that, half said they would do it because they needed the money. It said nearly 60% of respondents said that the new £985 figure would make them more likely to donate to a UK fertility clinic, suggesting that financial incentives are playing a growing role in donor decision making. Do we have a massive gap here in terms of knowledge as to what people are really doing this for and why? Because there will be people that want to do this altruistically, absolutely. But there will also be people that are doing this because financially it seems like the right thing to do for them. What hard evidence, apart from surveys such as that, do we have, and do we need to be collecting more data on this, Helen?
Completely. We are so worried about women coming forward for this because they need the money, and if you took away the money, hopefully that would go a long way to getting rid of that. And it's not about not rewarding women or compensating them or trying to put up barriers to them coming forward. We have no ideological position against egg donation per se, apart from the fact that it creates these massive harms, but we didn't come into it with a concern with it from the outset. It's only based on what we found. We have found women who reply to us or who have told their stories in the media who say they did it for the money. So one story said, the woman spent the £750. It went towards travelling. I've dipped into that pot for various things since then. Another, I was young, free, single and planning on going travelling in America. The £250 fee, £250, as it was back then, would come in pretty handy, I thought. I didn't really think about the bigger picture. I never considered that someone could contact me one day. Another woman, I've also donated in return for the company, freezing my eggs, so it's not totally altruistic. And that woman also said, I haven't really considered what it would be like to have the children contact me when they're 18. Now, in terms of studies, our campaign group has no funding, no resource. We do this around our jobs and children in our spare time because we are that worried about these issues of surrogacy and egg donation. What we rely on is women coming to us. We don't even actively seek them out, but every time we mention egg donation, women reply to us and say, I did it and I'd never do it again. I did it and I ended up needing hysterectomy. I did it and I nearly died. So these are these reports, and I know there was written evidence that criticised, probably us, for use of anecdotes and said we shouldn't change the law because of anecdotes. Well, I would agree, but if the fertility industry had done their jobs properly and tracked women over the last 30 years, none of us would need to be sat here today.
With the greatest respect, Helen, there will be a self-selecting group of people that will be going to an organisation called Surrogacy Concern. You're not going to get a complete blanket overview of everybody's experiences. You will get, by the very nature of it, a self-selecting group of people that have had real issues. And it is not to say that they aren't serious and the anecdotal side of it isn't important. It is. But I think where we have industry saying there isn't a problem, we need to have hard and quite clear data that can stack up the issues that I think we feel could be there. Yes. But we need to be able to have data that is undeniably clear and transparent, and I would say take a broad breadth of the people that are involved. Who would be best placed to do that, do you think?
It's very hard because you're relying on the women who come to the clinics saying. Now, vulnerable women, and I think in the last panel they said vulnerable women aren't doing this. I mean, vulnerable women don't go around wearing a sign saying that they're vulnerable, so there's no way of necessarily identifying that. I think data we can use is the data that the HFVA have provided on the multiple deciles of multiple deprivation. So we saw that in the bottom three, there was over 4,000 women who donated their eggs from 2011, when the payments went up to £750, to 2020, who were from the poorest postcodes in the UK. So that's an indicator. When the HFEA say it's rooted in altruism, I've done as much digging around in the HFEA website as I can about this. They say that egg donors are from comparable areas of the country to other women, and they link to academic studies. Some of those academic studies were to do with the witnesses who you saw last time. Their groups of donors that they've looked at were, I think, 25 in the UK, then 16, another study of 11, another survey of 124 donors. So those aren't what you can rely on, I think, to say that it's safely altruistic. I just don't think the evidence is there that it's altruistic. Now, you could say, well, the evidence isn't there, Helen, that women are coming forward because they're hard up either. But I don't think the evidence is there.
And that's what I'm asking. Who is the best placed person and organisation to collect this evidence?
I don't know if
in the
there is
most
one.
unbiased and kind of, I would say, open way for women's and all women's experiences on it.
So the HFEA, we're very lucky that the HFEA has one of the largest databases in the world since 1991. But some of it does come down to how you are interpreting the data that you're seeing. So the figure that Helen mentioned, 4,000 donors from the lowest three areas. For the same period of time, we have 3,000 coming from the highest three areas. So what does that evidence say to you? How do you interpret that evidence? If we're having very similar numbers coming forward from the highest socioeconomic areas as the lowest socioeconomic areas, to me that would say that the socioeconomic conditions were not the major factor. So there is data in the HFEA that we can look at. Certainly, I think academics, my colleagues who were on the panel last time, these are not people who have a vested interest in proving donation one way or another. And actually, in order to get funding, in order to go through ethical approval in our universities, we do have to prove that our methodology is sound and that that our results are rigorous and reliable in various ways. So I do think that's the kind of information. If you want information around people's sense of whether they felt they were autonomous, whether they felt they consented, whether they regret, that's not the kind of data that you would gain from very large-scale surveys with very large numbers of people. That's the kind of data you would get from detailed qualitative research where you have the time to individually speak to people and to really understand their experiences and narratives. So there is a bit of a clash there. If you want really huge numbers, it would tend to be survey data. If you want real in-depth about people's decision-making, it would be qualitative. Things like the Good Morning Britain thing, the reason I wouldn't consider that robust research, as it were, is because what people say they might do and what they actually do is, very, very different. So in my mind, that doesn't say anything about who is actually donating.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Rebecca.
Thank you. I was just hoping to talk a bit more about advertising now. And so I'd like to hear from both of you about whether you think we've got the balance right around regulation. And I raised this in the last session that we had, actually. So one of the things that I was surprised to learn was that sort of young 20-somethings are getting targeted all over their social media, and I was really confused. I was like, I'm not getting targeted, and then I realised, well, I'm banging on towards 50 now, so that's probably why they're not interested in my eggs. But that did sort of give me cause for concern, because I start thinking about my daughter and her friends as they get older starting to be targeted for that. So could you both maybe talk a little bit about the state of the adverts that you're seeing? And I think you've already alluded to some of it, and your thoughts on that, and what changes we potentially need to make to improve the regulation.
Yeah, I am also concerned about some of the advertising we're seeing, especially because it's so fast-paced. The Advertising Standards Agency and the CMA, they did sort of put in an enforcement notice to the fertility sector and then said there's actually very high compliance with the adverts at the moment, the adverts that they've analysed. But as you say, we also know that there are these adverts appearing in social media, and we're just doing a research study at the moment at UCL looking into that. It is an issue, and as I've said, the HFEA has no remit over that side of the fertility sector, and I think it would be really important for there to be some oversight. So yeah, I'm concerned about the advertising. We also did a piece of research a few years ago now, in 2020, that looked at clinic websites and the ways in which they were talking in particular about egg freezing, and found that the information there wasn't balanced. It tended to overestimate the benefits and underestimate the risks. Certainly the costs were never quite clear, and I think there's been research since by colleagues at Queen Mary that also shows still there's an unclarity of costs of treatment, and that I find that very inexcusable, because that's a very simple place to inform people adequately, to not add additional stresses to what is already a fairly stressful procedure. So yeah, I do think there is something to be done. There are also, and I've provided this in my written evidence, increasingly difficult to discern and decipher elements in social media where influencers might have agreements or might be documenting their egg freezing journeys in ways that are kind of advertising. Yeah. So, and I think also it's broader than, unfortunately, these messages are broader than just the adverts provided by IVF clinics. Young people are part of a whole social culture in terms of how we think about aging. And in fact, the egg freezing sector is not entirely independent from, the beauty sector that is also telling women that aging is terrible and bad and you should, remain youthful for as long as possible. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I do think regulatory change to allow the HFEA to be able to action things on advertising would be useful.
Before I move on to Helen, can I just ask, so you mentioned that UCL is doing some work on this, doing a study. How soon will we see findings from that? And is that something that we could potentially have a look at?
Well, it's actually my student Nicoletta is doing her PhD on social media advertising on egg freezing. So it won't be available for in the timescale of this committee, but certainly we can send you some of our preliminary. I mean, one of the things actually I will note that was an unexpected finding for us, because we went into it thinking that there might be a lot of advertising and some covert advertising, and actually one of the things we were surprised to find is that on social media there's also a lot of discussion of the problems and risks. So individual women talking about having gone back and none of their eggs having thawed, or having experienced complications, or having not felt that they were fully prepared. So that's also quite interesting that there is also those discussions going on social media, which are quite informative as well. It's not purely a one-sided picture.
No, thank you. And Helen, same question for you.
So we have real concerns again about advertising. The fact that you can make reference to the £985, although you're not supposed to reference financial gain. I mean, this is just a complete contradiction in terms. Either you can reference financial gain or you can't. If you reference the £985, that's financial gain. The idea that, but it's the compensation, so it's not. I mean, it's just an argument for the birds, to be perfectly honest. Adverts do not have to list health risks in small print or up front. Now, the number of adverts you see for any product or procedure on the London Underground or in your magazines, in your newspapers or on your phone that have to say in the terms and conditions in the small print, this may cause X, Y or Z, you may not get back what you invested, etc. They don't have to say that for these adverts. For egg retrieval, which is hugely invasive, it's ludicrous. Whatever you think about the subject of egg donation per se, I don't know why anyone would disagree with saying you must legally have health risks on the advert. Our preference is that adverts should be banned. Asking women as young as 18 to donate their eggs for use by others, people who may be wealthier than them, twice their age, etc., should not be proactively allowed in our view. But if they are to be continued to be allowed, they absolutely must state the health risks up front, and the reference to any financial gain whatsoever, call it compensation or whatever you want to call it, must be removed from those ads, because that is a huge incentive to young women. And I'd say something about the marketing of this as well, which is that clinics, I think, and egg banks certainly, often sort of love bomb women. So you get this language about do something amazing, do something miraculous, create a family for someone else, change people's lives. It's so wonderful. Like, you're asking a woman to inject her body with hormones for weeks, not for her own use later in IVF or for her own egg freezing even, but to give to somebody else. This is not in young women's interests, and these adverts are very misleading. And I should say, because I would like this on the record, we complained to the Advertising Standards Agency in October 2024 about, I think, 4 adverts, one of which they only banned 2 weeks ago, and we think they only banned it in response to the committee holding this inquiry in the first place. Now, I've been meaning to write to the committee about that, and I will do so, Chair. You will have that for the public record, and you will have our email from October 2024 to the ASA, and you will have their response in which they said they didn't think at the time there was a case to answer. We think there are a lot of organisations now backpedalling because they realise they've been slow on egg donation and welfare and their responsibility to egg donors for years, and they're starting to realise we didn't do enough for these young women as much as we should have done, and they're trying to cover themselves now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Rebecca. Christine has a follow-up.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something. You were talking about all the adverts for drugs and everything which have small print and list the risks, and there's nothing on the egg donation adverts. Surely once, if someone sees one of these adverts and thinks, oh, that I've been looking for a clinic like that, I want to follow it up, when they actually contact the clinic has a duty of care to make sure that they know all the potential risks, side effects, it's not that they're not going to be told, it's just that because it's not a service which is available online, they're being told when they get to the point where they are actually going to come in contact with the service.
We would say that the risks should be up front because, I mean, at the moment you've got adverts for egg donor clinics, egg banks on the tube. You know, nothing there on the small print about saying undergoing egg donation or egg retrieval might cause ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. That's a known risk in the short term. So even with the long-term risks that are less well known, the short-term ones should be printed up front. I would say in terms of the informed consent point, well, surely when women are getting told the risks when they go, actually we've been told by some donors that their counselling session, if they had one, didn't really offer the time to go as deep as it should have done. When my donations didn't work, I felt like a complete failure. I think feeling like a failure was another side effect I wasn't fully prepared for. And another said, it's not at all clear enough how damaging and taxing the process can be on the body. This didn't go as deep as it should have done. Women aren't actually, some women anyway, are reporting to us that they're not told at the clinic that it will be as severe on them as it proves to be. Now, for some women, they may not have these significant hurts and harms, and we fully accept that. And if women aren't being hurt, then we're very glad. But for the ones who are, they're coming and telling us, oh, actually, our meeting and our chat about risks was perfunctory and brief and didn't really go into much detail. And I don't think women should have to get to the point of walking through a clinic's door before they get to the point where they're told up front, this could harm you. They deserve to have that information straight away.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. I'm going to hand over to Kim now.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. Thank you both for coming. This is really interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about psychological health and access to counselling for donors. I think you've both clearly said already that you think counselling prior to egg freezing should be mandatory.
Absolutely.
Just donating. For the record.
Prior to donating.
Yeah, prior to donating. Prior to donating, it should be mandatory. So we're clear on counselling. What are the psychological risks or considerations for donors and those who are freezing their eggs, in your opinion? And are these risks being properly assessed and mitigated throughout counselling? I'll start with you, Zeynep.
So we know that not everybody takes up the current offer of counselling. And as I've already said, that's one of the changes that the HFEA themselves have called for as well, certainly in the case of donation. Also in the case of egg freezing, I think counselling would be really important and to make that offer more robust, not necessarily to mandate it. And also just to take a sort of a half step back, as it were, I think counselling in the context of fertility treatment is not really necessarily what some people might imagine counselling to be. You know, it's not a very long therapeutic conversation. It's more of Angela's much better placed to speak to this on your next panel, but it's much more of a detailed information provision in order to enable informed consent. So obviously that should be as robust as possible. But I also want to say that we should be quite careful about being clear that just because there are certain choices we might not make when we're fully informed does not mean that another woman might not make the same choice, you know, with full autonomy for herself. And I think that's really, really important. And what we're trying to, I guess, argue for is a structure that enables that for as many people as possible. And just to go back to Helen's point about, you know, some of the adverts saying, like, give the gift of life, do something wonderful. I mean, egg donation is, and in most cases, you know, in the great majority of cases, it is something wonderful. And I think it's led to the birth of so many very loved children that would not have existed otherwise. And I think, you know, the fact that a lot of women do this altruistically, they feel that, and, you know, you heard from that in the last panel, they feel that what they've done is something wonderful. And so also I don't think we need to be completely, yes, I absolutely agree the harms should be stated, that should be very clearly done, but we also shouldn't shy away from framing donation in those terms, and the fact that there might be compensation to enable people to do that without losing out or without it being a major inconvenience. That's the same as, I might donate blood altruistically, but I might only do it if there's a blood donation happening in my local area that I can walk to. Do you see what I mean? So the fact that we make these things possible for people should not necessarily lead us to question their autonomy and ability to make informed choices.
Yeah, like most things, it's not straightforward, is it?
Absolutely.
It's a complex environment that we're dealing with, a really serious issue. So, Helen, to you then, in terms of, do you think the risks are being properly assessed around donors' psychological health and well-being, and what more could be done maybe in that regard?
And I think previous witnesses said there's scope for more studies on the long-term psychological effect, and there is a gap in the research about the long-term psychological impact, and we would agree with that completely. As I've said, some donors have reported to us that they didn't feel that they were adequately prepared for how they would feel in the longer term. Views change as we mature across the life course, and as women have their own children or don't have their own children, may come to feel about this differently. As women go through menopause, and views evolve. Now, that is not about saying in any sort of paternalistic way, lots of women are going to come forward and regret it, therefore they shouldn't be allowed to do it in the first place. I think some people are misinterpreting our concerns about this, which is largely based on the for-profit sector preying on young women and not in their best interests. We think that as the dust settles for some donors over the longer term, given that some women are coming to us now and saying, I do regret this and I wish I hadn't done it, we think we may see more of that. We were interestingly contacted by one woman whose friend actually was a sperm donor, and he'd done it in the 1990s as a student for beer money. And to this day, he bitterly regrets it because he knows he's got children out there who he will never know and he will never see. Yes, that's one example, but this is a real person with a real crushing sense of what have I done and what did I do? And so these psychological impacts do exist. And we have started now seeing, there was a story in the newspaper, I think I might have linked to it in our written submission, of a woman who'd undergone egg freezing and tried for many years to make that work, and it hadn't. And she was crushed, I think, as the numbers of women freezing their eggs come forward, particularly because so many of them are over the age of 35. For many of them, it is not going to work. The fertility clinic will have taken thousands of pounds off their money, and then, of course, they'll be left in their 40s with no children at the end of it. Those women are going to be particularly crushed, I think. And I think we need to understand that often with these sorts of cases, if women feel like they're on their own, they won't come forward. It takes many years for women to come forward. If you look at the issue that we saw in the 20th century around forced adoption, it was often women going into mother and baby homes in the 1950s, handing over babies when they didn't really want to, but the state and charities and often religious institutions had this framework whereby women had to have their babies taken off them, and it was often 40 or 50 years before they came forward and said, I didn't want to do that and I shouldn't have been made to do that, and I was. Now, I'm not trying to draw parallels between the two, I'm just trying to illustrate the point that women's views and ideas change, and so do men's, and without mandatory counselling even, how on earth can we say there's fully informed consent at the moment and that we are trying to mitigate against psychological harms? We're not doing that at the moment.
That's really helpful, thank you. Thank you both.
Can I just quickly follow up and say, yes, just I think Helen did raise an important point there. In the case of egg freezing, one of the most important considerations is to just be absolutely clear that this is in no way, shape or form a guarantee of a baby. And I think that's the most, for me, one of the most concerning things is if a woman freezes her eggs with the idea in the back of her mind that she's got ready children, and then makes life decisions based on that assumption, and that's an erroneous assumption. So it's really important to be very clear about that.
Absolutely, and I think in both situations, informed consent is only informed consent if it's informed.
You can't, if you're not sure about the risks, it's not fully informed, and that's what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you, Chair.
Very much. This comes on to Rosie's section on informed consent and aftercare. Rosie.
Thank you, Chair. We've obviously touched on this in terms of advertising and things, and I know we're short of time, but is there enough informed consent about, whichever you want to answer, about things like ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome? And could you briefly both sort of maybe say how many women you think are at risk of that? I mean, how high is that in people who do donate?
I think the RCOG, and I defer to them, I think said it was a third of all young women under 30 might get mild OHSS, and 1 to 2% would get severe or critical. So we're guided by their clinical evidence. Our wider view is donors aren't able to give informed consent at the moment because of the reasons we've set out. The risks aren't on the adverts. The payments are there, which will always prove to be for many women a financial incentive or inducement or motivation, and that's a risk of exploitation. And there aren't the long-term studies. I mean, we talked about studies before. There's one, I think, at the moment at the University of Manchester, looking at the cardiovascular health of women who undergo IVF or mothers and babies, and in their Home Office positioning paper, because it involves animal experimentation, they said they thought 27% of women might show harms of, I think it's stroke and another harm. Yes, here we are. Long-term effects of in vitro fertilisation on the maternal fetal cardiovascular system. Women that undergo IVF are 27% more likely to have developed hypertension or have a stroke in later life. Now, I couldn't see where the study was that they'd drawn that from, though I did find the ovarian tumour risk study that you referenced. But I think there are a lack of long-term studies, which means that there's a gap in the knowledge base. So I don't believe giving informed consent is fully possible, especially when our own government have said, well, we haven't commissioned or seen any research. It's like, well, then why are you letting these adverts go on without at least the known short-term risks to be printed on them? How can you give informed consent? I just don't think it's possible at the moment.
Thank you. So informed consent, probably you'd both agree, needs to be strengthened, the process.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just... Yeah, I think the aftercare piece is a really important piece. So the medical treatment that you receive, whether you're going through IVF or egg freezing or egg donation, is the same. It's the stimulation of the ovaries, it's egg collection, but obviously the actual mechanisms around them are a bit different. So if you're having IVF treatment, you're then going to go back and have an embryo put back, so the clinic necessarily has a longer term overview. There is now some evidence, the evidence from UCLH that I mentioned that's just been submitted for publication to the BMJ, to suggest that women undergoing egg freezing might be having poorer aftercare because, as it were, their eggs have been collected and then they've sort of waved bye-bye to the clinic. And I've qualitatively interviewed a number of women who then ended up in hospital and who were in some cases, they called up their clinic and were told, well, just contact your local A&E, which obviously is not, that's not appropriate. That's not what we would want to see. And aftercare is really, really important. There is quite, the numbers of women who've gone through IVF in this country are now very high. We've had over 2 million cycles of IVF in the UK, so huge, huge numbers. And so we know that overall it is a safe procedure, but I think, having more follow-up and better understanding, and certainly requiring clinics to perform better aftercare. And some clinics might already be doing that in really conscientious ways, but requiring that across the board is no bad thing.
Thank you. So that's another thing we need to strengthen. You'd be astonished. I've done a lot of work on women's health. No area of women's health, birth trauma included, has aftercare or follow-up. It's just a recurring theme, and I've done this for 9 years. Okay, do we know enough about the experiences of women who go on and try to use their frozen eggs? Again, does that come back to more data collection?
Yeah, so because the practice of egg freezing is relatively recent, so the numbers have only really been increasing in this country since like 2014, and still the numbers are low. We're talking about 20,000 cycles overall of egg freezing. And because it is predominantly, there are different reasons for some of it might be medical, some of it might be part of a clinical IVF process, but the great majority of those cycles are what we call elective or social egg freezing, so to be used later. So by its very nature, the great majority of people who have frozen their eggs have not come back to use them and may never come back to use them. And I'm currently doing some research on women who have frozen their eggs at least, some years ago about their decision making. But it's hard to do that research because they're not a concentrated group that are available somewhere that you can target. We know that some of those women go on to have children outside of clinics. Some might still be keeping their options open about whether they're going to have children. Some might have given up on having families altogether. So there's a huge variety of experiences after that, but the numbers that have come back to use their eggs so far is really low, and so it's very hard to sort of say definitive things about them.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Helen, did you want to come in on that one?
Just on the experience of aftercare, yes, we would agree. It seems to be a very mixed picture, with some clinics not following up on donors, and of course, they're not mandated to do so in the long term and not tracking those health outcomes, which we think they should. One woman reported to us and said, I later also found out I have a genetic condition. I tried to reach out to the clinic and let them know to pass on the information to the recipients and that I'd be open to them contacting me anytime if they wanted to. The clinic couldn't care less, no intention of passing anything on. Actually, they passed responsibility to the HFEA. So I think that's worked.
To me, that would seem like a case of the regulator working well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rosie. I just wanted to clarify a position, Helen, because it sounded a bit like that you believe that informed consent just can't exist in this scenario. Is that the case?
No. It can, but it's not there yet, or it's not there currently because of the lack of risks on the adverts. What I would say is, until we have proper long-term cohort data evidence on how this affects women 30 years down the line, there's always going to be a gap in the evidence. So you could say to women, we know there's short-term risks now, you should be aware of OHSS and the other things like perforated bowels and abscesses, etc. But longer term, clinics should be clear with women, there's not been these huge cohort studies of donors going over the 25, 30 years that egg donation's been quite widespread. So therefore, there are known unknowns.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to be clear.
No, I think it's about being honest with women. There's known unknowns, and there always will be until you get the long-term data.
I just wanted to be clear that that's what informed consent looks like to you, and actually, even if you had that, you would be comfortable with people donating eggs. Do you believe that if they had that, because there is with any health procedure, there will be unknowns.
Of course.
Yeah.
And
so
side effects.
I just wanted. I wanted to get where you were coming from when you said about the problems that you have with informed consent.
So, no, we think certainly in the immediate term there isn't informed consent now because there's no health risk on the adverts. We have wider issues with egg donation per se because we take a different view in that often you will hear and have heard, I think, a discussion about a shortage of eggs, for example, and this being the only way that people can have families, and nobody fails to have sympathy with that view. But there is also a feminist view, which is that these women's eggs belong to these women, and they are not to be, young women should not be being preyed on for their eggs to be used as a resource by others. That's a bigger political point outside of the framework of how egg donation works in Britain today.
And that's what I wanted to get to about that point of that kind of that feminist ideology that you have just described. Is it that your position that actually this donation shouldn't exist at all?
We would be more comfortable if it didn't, because it's not, we don't think it's an appropriate thing to ask a woman for.
That's why I was trying to get to with the informed consent as to whether it's ever going to be enough, or whether it's actually an issue with the process itself and the way it...
While, if egg donation is legal, it needs to be a decision for the individual woman, and I think there's perhaps a misunderstanding of our view that we somehow think women can't consent at all or shouldn't be allowed to or something. No, that's not our view. If there are better safeguards there, raise the age and get rid of the payments and make the ban the adverts, or make them at least very clear on what is involved. If women still want to do it, that is up to them. I mean, that's the point about saying raise the minimum age of donation. Then if you get to 25 or 21, whatever it is, if women still want to go and do it, that is their choice. But in a democracy, as campaigners for the rights of women and children, and it's children who we should always centre in these discussions too, we have the right to say, there is a bigger, widespread societal problem if you make women's eggs be seen as something that people have a right to access, and it's something you can just go and buy as though you were going shopping. If you go on the London Egg Bank website and you look at their sort of categories of how you filter out your donors, it's a bit like online dating, and there are real societal harms there with allowing that to continue. And we see a lot of very misogynistic content on videos on social media of people who've gone and bought eggs and are holding up baskets of chickens' eggs and talking about how they selected their donor, and it's really nasty stuff. And so we wanted you to be aware of that wider context, that we absolutely want the safeguards to be improved now for women in Britain in the here and now today. But
Thank
there
you
are
very
wider
much.
issues.
It would be really useful if you could forward those examples to us. That would be really useful to the committee. I'm going to switch over to the next panel now, but I want to say thank you very much, Zeynep and Helen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our second panel, and I know that our next guests were sitting throughout that first panel. I no doubt would have seen snippets of our previous witness sessions as well. Welcome to the Women and Equality Select Committee, Dr. Ippokratis Sarris, Executive Committee Member and Consultant in Reproductive Health at the British Fertility Society, and Angela Pericleous-Smith, Chair of the British Infertility Counselling Association. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much. I've got some quick questions, kind of based a little bit more about the health risks and the practicalities on this. We've heard already some serious concerns that clinics don't currently communicate health risks to egg donors and egg freezing patients. How valid do you feel that those concerns are? And clinics reported 224 grade B incidents in 2024 to 2025. What type of incidents are considered grade B, and to what extent would they have an impact on egg donors? Angela, I'll start with you if that's okay.
From a counsellor's perspective and the people we work with, the patients we work with, I do think, generally speaking, that those health risks are portrayed quite well to patients within their consultations, the written information, and kind of the guidance given to clinics to provide that information. And then, again, hopefully with counselling, they've got more of an opportunity to explore those health risks for themselves. But I think there's also something very true in there about patients' kind of understanding of those health risks as well, and what their kind of expectations are, and kind of from like a lived experience, if you like, some patients don't actually truly know what those kind of risks are until they're in it, even though they can read it. You know, we can read on a box of paracetamol what the risks are, but until we have any of those side effects, we can't truly appreciate those.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Dr. Sarris.
Yes, thank you first of all for having me. I think it's quite complex giving risk to patients and also consent, and I do agree that can be done very well or very badly as well. I think there's multiple levels. First of all, to say about provision of information. The fertility sector is one of the most, probably the most regulated area of healthcare in the UK and probably around the world as well. And a lot of information is mandated and is given to patients at multiple touch points, which can be a little bit of an issue as well. So of course there's the oral information that any good clinician should be doing consultation. That's under obviously the remit of the GMC as well. So we should also know that it's not just the HFEA, which is the only regulator of the sector, they're also professional regulators. And I would consider that good practice for any doctor doing anything in medicine to give information about what they're doing to their patients. And that's documented in the notes, which of course the patients have a right to, and they most of the times do take. Beyond that, there's also written information that clinics must give to patients, patient information leaflets, which the HFEA comes and inspects. Actually, I've just had an inspection yesterday with the HFEA, and they asked for hundreds of documents, and they read through all of them. But beyond that, there's also then consenting when you're actually doing a treatment, and if anybody's had an operation, there's a whole list of information there, and usually there's also, not always, but most of the time, also percentages as well. There has actually been criticism that we're giving too much information to patients. Actually, when you have too much information, you have information overload. So I think there's a difference between having the information, reading it, and I agree with what Angela said, is actually understanding it as well. And that is all of healthcare. Now, I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't give information, and it's a very, very complex area. But there's also a problem with over giving too much information, and I do agree that anybody who's going through IVF, egg freezing, egg donation should have all the information. If the right place to put it is in an advert or not, we can have a discussion with one of the other questions about it. But it's definitely given at the time of a consultation and the consenting process. If it's not, that's not a problem with regulation, because regulation says that you should do it. It's with the implementation and potentially policing of the regulations, and actually the regulator should step in if there's an issue there. And same thing with medical practice, for example, if a doctor's not doing what they're meant to do. So this is not just a fertility question. So I think that is with regards to generally about consenting information. If we go about the short-term complications which people are talking about, infection, bleeding, injury to organs, OHSS, all that is clearly documented in a consent, and it is mentioned every time someone does a procedure. I just did a procedure in the morning, and I went through it, and we explained to it, and we have a signed consent as well. Healthcare is not zero risk, and unfortunately there will always be complications, especially if you treat complex patients. So apart from my hat as the British Fertility Society sort of chair-elect now, I'm also Director of King's Fertility just down the road, one of the biggest clinics in the UK. So of course, if you do thousands of procedures, even something 1 in 1,000 will happen. That's all documented. I think that the question that I've been hearing is the long-term effects. Now, the long-term effects, I should say that obviously IVF has been around since 1978, so there is decades of children having been born. 3% of almost all children born in the UK right now is through IVF treatment, so, and actually that's low compared to other countries. For example, Denmark, that's 10%. So there have been millions of children and women that have been born and treated. Now, when it comes down to some of the risks, and I put it in our evidence as well, there's a lot of long-term data with regards to cancer risk, for example, and it is true to say that there have been some contradicting information. So of course, when you cherry pick one study versus another, it looks like you can prove whatever you want. But all the meta-analysis that have been written, actually one from my group as well, looking at breast cancer specifically, has not shown that when you compare the right group, which is women that are having IVF treatment versus those that are having infertility and not having treatment, because it's a very different demographic from just, and their background medical consideration when you have wrong treatment groups, which you compare, has not shown any increased risk in those long-term cancers, which is, I think, very important, because even a small risk of a common cancer, like, for example, breast cancer, will obviously translate to a lot of women's harm. With regards to one of the things that I heard about cardiac, actually, we just published a small, relatively paper, nonetheless, with my PhD students, and we found that women that had IVF treatment versus not had, when we looked at the cardiovascular status with echoes and other sort of kind of parameters, we did not see a lasting effect. Now, that does not mean that there might not be 10, 20, 30 years down the line, I agree, but the signal is not there, considering that this has been going on for a very long time.
Thank you. I've got two questions following on from what you've just said, and that was really useful. The first one is, obviously present company excluded, doctors aren't known for their best communication skills always, particularly when it comes to speaking to women and women's health. We already have had a report on medical misogyny and have called for some pretty hard recommendations to improve that. Is there a case to be made that it isn't just about the amount of information, but the accessibility and the user-friendliness of that information that needs to be readily available for anybody potentially donating eggs and freezing their own eggs?
100% agree. I'm not going to disagree with that. And it's a constant sort of, I wouldn't say battle, but a balance between how much information you can give it and how simply you can give it. And specifically in my sort of own sort of practice and clinic, we've had almost contradicting advice. One of it was actually, we looked at some ISO accreditation and says that the average reading level of, somebody is like 4th or 5th grade, and you have to write information in that sort of simple terms, which is great. But then you have the regulator, which rightly so says that you have to provide all this very complex information. So how do you marry those two things and you don't end up with something that's 100 pages long? If I had a simple answer, I would definitely give it to you. But I do think more work has to be done in that area of how we give medical information. And also, that's a little bit, I'm sorry I'm digressing, where potentially the power but also the pitfalls of stuff like social media can be there. So we just published a paper last year with my group about the misinformation and social media and fertility. And what was, thank you, yes, my name correctly spelled. It is long, apologies. And we found that and it's obviously publicly available, happy to send it, that the majority of information in social media is not from credible sources, is not written in language which is appropriate, and it's also not. Is incorrect as well. It doesn't mean that there isn't good information out there. It just gets flooded away. So, like it or not, our generation, I don't want to insult anyone, but our generation consumes information very, very differently. In the past, it used to be more sort of a consumer sort of to expert approach, but now it's a lived experience, and a influencer to another influencer, and that is beyond just what the HFA and fertility world can do. And actually, most of the times, what I do in my practice is countering misinformation that patients come with and wanting stuff which I sometimes I don't even know where they found it from. I have to go and ask them where it is so I can research it myself. So there's a very big balance between accessible, easy information, correct information, and also what is regulatory compliant. And you can see all the paperwork I have for you to answer your questions. Even I can't get it right and understand it. So it is a complex area, and I think we should admit ourselves that we can get it better, but it was never going to be perfect as our knowledge constantly evolves around all these things.
Thank you. Angela, we'll be coming to you specifically on counselling in a bit, so this one's very much the health focus. The second question I had around that was, even though that this has been happening for decades, IVF and egg donation and egg freezing has been happening for decades, we do know that there has been a massive lack of research done onto the impact of women's health, just generally. Doesn't matter whether it's IVF and fertility, just generally. We have not been considered in these medical advancements and the long-term impacts. Would you say that there needs to be more research done and demographic data collected to identify groups that might be at higher risk, to better understand kind of experiences of aftercare? And do you think clinics in the UK would be open to a framework for long-term follow-up?
Right, so first of all, just a little bit of a sort of funny little anecdote, I guess, is actually fertility research is the only area of medicine which is predominantly in research the women rather than the men, although it's 50% of infertility is men. And actually one of my old fellows did a little study, and he found that although 50-50 is the fertility issue that we see in our clinics, only 1% of all fertility research is on men. So actually a bit sort of interesting that most of what we do is about women, for good enough reasons, obviously.
It does seem to stop immediately after the pregnancy has been successful.
But the problem that we have with a lot of medicine is the longevity of being able to gather data. And I think you mentioned it about also birth trauma and the rest. And I think there is a great appetite among the more academically minded and doctors in general to have that information. Now, the problem is it's very fragmented. And one solution, for example, is to link the database. We talk about the HFEA, but it's also the NHS databases. And some of the best data that we have out there has come from the Nordic countries, where they have these big data, national databases, where they've managed to link them, and they got lifelong experience. They can look at lifelong sort of courses, and we've got regulatory constraints here. It's not specifically about the HFEA, but it has to do with data collection, with GDPR. It has to do with with consent. I'm not saying they're not valid reasons, where it's almost impossible. And we've been trying to link database a lot here in the UK of my research group, and it's so difficult and impossible. And I think that's where the answer is. The answer is not an individual clinic which might or might not exist in 30 or 40 years, which might or might not being sold, a doctor which might not have retired. The data is out there. We just need to link it together, and with new technology we can follow life cycles. And then there are a lot of people who are interested in academics around who would want to give those answers. We actually want those answers, but it can't be an individual clinic level. It's not powerful enough.
Okay, thank you. We did see some first-hand experience of that, and from geneticists in Iceland as well, where they have huge amounts of data. The other question I wanted to ask is guidance in the US, and we don't really want to take any lessons, particularly from the US on this. Recommends 6 donation cycle limits for a woman in her lifetime. In the UK, there is a limit of 10 families, but not on cycles. Should there be?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, and I was just looking at all the different countries and what they've done, and in many ways the UK does sound sort of very liberal in that. It's mainly from the where sperm donation becomes more of an issue, because of course they can create lots of families, and there's a lot of issues with international number of families. I'm sure you've heard about it. But what is interesting is that even if the limit was changed, the HFE, its own data, just showing is that the on average egg donors undergo 1.4 donation cycles, and fewer than 1%, so actually 0.7% of these donors have undergone more than 5 egg donation cycles. So we're talking about a very, very small number. I don't inherently have a disagreement with having a cap of some sort. I think exactly what that should be there, that can be up into debate. It's almost impossible that one donor can have not just 10 children, but 10 families with multiple children. It practically and feasibly, that's clearly not happened. There's a very small number. If that 5 is high or not, I think that's fine. But it seems almost self-regulated, just from the physicality of what's going on, and that's what the numbers show. So I think that is a relatively smaller issue for egg donors, but it could be looked at without, I think, greatly changing availability of and what is the donor pattern of what they do.
Thank you. Angela, did you want to add anything on that point about... No? Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand straight over to Christine then, who's going to talk about demographics.
Good afternoon.
And then I'm coming to David.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I could ask you why you think the proportion of donors between 18 and 25 has doubled in the past 10 years. And does it raise any concerns for you, the fact that there's this increase in younger women?
So I was looking again at the data, and what is interesting, it's doubled if you compare 2009, 2013, but actually from 2014 to 2023, there's been a relatively small number. Now, I think inherently having people that donate from a medical point of view now, from a younger age, is better. We can argue if it's 18, 19 or 21. Actually, there is some data that suggests that eggs from... And that has to do also with egg freezing as well. If you're younger than 21, you actually have a higher proportion of abnormal eggs, the same way as if you were older as well. And it's almost like a U-shape. And there are various biological reasons why we think that is. So it's 18 to 24, but actually 18 to 21 medically is probably not as optimal. So from that point of view, medically it makes more sense. I think if we think that this is a proxy potentially for, I think where the worry is if there is vulnerability exploitation, I think that's a discussion which cannot be just pulled out of just crude number like this. But the change seems to have been more subtle since 2014 versus before that, and on average, the age of donation in the UK HFEA database has not changed. But from looking at it, there seems a slight sort of shift that you have older women donating less, which medically is probably more appropriate, and some younger women donating more, and it seems that the average is the same. I think the answer to that is one needs to look at it in more detail to understand exactly why that pattern. One answer could be, but I'm just hypothesizing here, is that younger people in general have better access to information, because everybody has a phone now and everybody can look at things, and information, not necessarily just adverts, it's also social media, it's also people interacting with each other. So that is a possibility, but I can't prove that because obviously this is just crude numbers. I don't know if Angela, you would know.
Want to add anything? HIFA guidance says that egg donors should be under 35, apart from in exceptional circumstances. But around 15% of egg donors between 2011 and 2020 were 36 and over. Why is this? And does the age of the donor present any specific or significant health risks?
Yes, so there is an international agreement that donors should be less than 35, and actually probably a little bit less than that as well when it comes down to if you're going through the effort of donating to have the success as well for the recipient. But the exception that we're referring to is usually it refers to people that have a genetic relationship with that donor. So we find, for example, that you have women and their sister might want to donate, or it can be anybody else. And there is that sort of genetic link. And it's never ideal from a point of view of success, but that is also part of the understanding and counselling of, or it should be, and to my experience it is, of explaining why that's not ideal. And that's what, and the HFE always, when it comes to inspections, will look at those cases to understand why that is. So it tends to be that sort of exceptions. I can't say it's 100%, I'm sure there might be other reasons as well. Because that genetic link tends to sort of be preferable for in that sort of situation versus an altruistic anonymous donor. And that usually tends to be altruistic because there's no money, at least knowingly there's no money that changes hand. When it comes down to the risk to the women themselves donating after the age of 35, there's no inherent difference in the risk procedurally. The only exception would be, like most of us, as we become older, we're more likely to have medical problems ourselves than by and large our younger selves. But that comes out in the pre-donation screening that you're mandated to do to exclude by law conditional diseases. So of course if you had an unhealthy person who wants to donate at any age for that matter, that would not be medically appropriate. So there shouldn't be any more risk if you're older, younger, if you selected correctly. What is different is the success rate, and usually that is because of an overarching reason that tends to be usually genetics.
Okay. Can I just ask you briefly, just to go back to the first bit, do you think that's an area where we do need more research? We do need to find out more. Why are younger women coming forward?
I think any research to understand why people are coming forward for anything, sperm donor as well, we heard before, and there is a good thing. We have good qualitative research, and some of them have been presented from some of the groups. I remember I tried to read almost everything that was sent in. There's a lot of information, I have to admit, but I did try to read it. And everything seems to be positive, but of course, as we've heard before, it captures a very small number. If we can have more data, more information, I think that would be useful. I agree.
Thank you, Christine. Dr. Sarris, before we move on, I just wanted to ask, what counts as a success rate? Because when advertising, I would say that there is inconsistencies with what they count and advertise as success when it comes to this process.
We're talking about.
You count as an.
I'll tell you exactly, but I just want to make sure I'm talking about egg donation, egg freezing, or about your own treatment.
All of them.
So the metric that most fertility people around the world now will consider success is a healthy baby with a healthy mother per treatment started. So it's not anymore, and that's sometimes where people fall foul when they look at success rates from outside the UK, where they will consider a success a pregnancy test, for example. But now it's not just to have a baby, it's to have a healthy baby, so, and the definition of how that is, and a healthy mother as well. I think that's, and then of course it's per whatever metric, usually it is per treatment started. In my opinion, the treatment started is when the first day you start any medication, because of course the denominator changes as you go through. And that's what people want when they come to a clinic is, hello doctor, I'm going to start medication. How likely am I to get a healthy baby? How many goes do I need to go? I think that's really the mark of success. But it's not just the baby, it's also the mother and everything that goes with it, and the journey as well, if you really want to put it into a more holistic sort of approach.
Really sensible measure and marker of success. Is that standardised across the UK currently?
So the HFEA has done some good work. Sorry, I don't know why I'm pointing. Sorry, the HFEA has done some good work, because I think there were some concerns that previous markers of success throughout were not appropriate. So, for example, they started with a success per embryo transfer procedure, which then meant that because people want to look better, they would put multiple embryos. Then they went per embryo transferred, which was great, but then people were saying, well, actually, there are other techniques like genetic testing that might make that look different. And now they've just moved to cumulative births per egg collection procedure over a 2-year period. Now, I know it sounds like a mouthful to say, but it's much more appropriate. The downside, it needs a much longer lead time to be able to get the data, so every data will be minimum 2 years old. But I think it's a good start, and I think it is appropriate. And that was based on a consultation that the HFEA did with the sector, and that's a good example of how things can work well.
Thank you very much. David?
Thank you very much. Some questions for you, Angela. This is concerning counselling. So, for you, what does good counselling practice for both egg donation and freezing look like, and how widely is that implemented? And I guess going on from that, are counsellors given adequate time and resources to deliver good counselling?
Thank you. Well, I think good counselling practice to me looks like implications counselling, which we already heard in the previous panel and the panel before, the evidence given before. That's not always routinely offered, not routinely mandated. So I think good implications counselling for me, so one is having the implications counselling, and that being routinely offered as part of the natural pathway, so it's not kind of seen as a tick box exercise, as sometimes it is, or sometimes it's just not routinely offered. It's being able to have that independent of the medical clinic side with a specialised fertility counsellor. And we also heard about the cost as well, that sometimes implications counselling is offered, but there's a fee for it. So can we truly say that it is being offered if there's a fee for it? So that should be freely available. And it's really being able to provide our patients with that opportunity to really kind of help prepare them for being donors, but from a kind of psychological perspective, kind of the impact for them, the impact now, how things might evolve in the future. And also at BICA, we're really adamant as well and advocate that partners of donors attend implications counselling as well, that if they're in a committed relationship, partners, spouses, should be attending implications counselling as well. So sorry, the second part of your question about how widely is it available?
Is there adequate time given to counsellors?
Again, what I would say, what BICA would say and advocate for is this isn't a one-off session, and sadly there is quite a lot of discrepancy across UK clinics. In some clinics, there's very good provision. It's freely available. It's a routine part of the pathway. We have great consultants kind of, really explaining what the purpose of implications counselling is and how it can benefit our patients, compared to, if people aren't explaining what the purpose of counselling is, and then some clinics aren't providing it, or there's a fee for it. That's inherent, isn't it? Because the decision to donate does come with permanent, lifelong decisions, which are really important that people have the opportunity to really explore what that means for them now and in the future.
Just thinking you talk about implications counselling, so does the counselling include the possibility of the egg donor discovering that they may have a genetic condition?
Yes. Yes, so obviously we're not genetic counsellors, but yeah, that exploration of, how would it be if a genetic condition was discovered, what what might that mean for you? Of course, and Beaker has recently published a new professional resource for delivering implications counselling in UK clinics, and that's published in there as well. It's so our new resource is intended for clinic staff, not just counsellors, but clinic staff, PRs, consultants, anybody involved in the donation pathway. But yes, absolutely, in counselling, that exploration of what if a genetic is discovered.
Just following on from that point you've just made then, so would the counsellor within a clinic be a trained counsellor, or could it be a clinician who's not necessarily trained in the area of counselling, who's just given some guidance?
Very good question. No. A counsellor in a fertility clinic, and the Code of Practice does have the qualification criteria in the Code of Practice, and Beaker again have advocated hard over the years to have a qualified fertility counsellor delivering implications counselling. So it's not a nurse, a consultant delivering that implications counselling. Don't get me wrong, they're very knowledgeable, but they don't do what counsellors do, which is really exploring that psychological and psychosocial implications for our patients.
Good. How widely is follow-up counselling available, and should clinics, in your opinion, be required to offer more than one pre-treatment session?
In my opinion, yes, clinics should be required to offer more than one pre-treatment. Again, many of our patients may only require one session, but some, and looking at kind of audit reports from counsellors across Beaker, it is usually less than 10%, 15% of our patients that do require more than one. But again, this isn't just like going in and fixing a broken elbow, and our feelings change over time and we can't predict those. So having the ability to have more than one, I can't remember, I think it was on the previous panel about how complex it is, how much information is involved. That's hard to kind of explore all of that in one session, and people need that time to be able to go away, reflect, think about it, maybe discuss with family members, and come back and explore some more. So yes, what more than one should definitely be there. Sorry, could you repeat the first part of the question?
No, it's just how is follow-up counselling widely available? So it sort of links in, really.
Yeah, and again, there's those disparities there from the clinics that have very good provision of that to clinics that there isn't provision of that. And from Beaker perspective, it is quite concerning that some of the bigger providers of egg donation do not routinely provide implications counselling or later counselling.
So I guess following on from that, do you think counselling should be mandatory?
Yes, from Beaker's perspective, we have advocated before, and in the law reform a couple of years ago, we advocated for mandated implications counselling, because it really is that opportunity. And sometimes if people are on their best behaviour because they want to come through, If, for example, it's a clinic that is not routinely offering implications counselling and people are on their best behaviour, or when the donor seems fine, then they don't know if there's any issues there.
Final question from me. How well do you think clinics integrate the implications of commercially available DNA testing into their counselling? And do you think there should be national guidance updated to reflect the technological realities that exist now?
Yes. Well, the HFEA, again, in their Code of Practice, has about kind of DNA testing websites and kind of clinics' responsibilities to ensure that patients are aware of DNA testing websites and such. But again, I think there's a big difference between giving patients information and them being aware of DNA testing websites and how they're evolving, to actually being able to have the opportunity to sit down understand that information and think about how that might impact them and their families in the future as well. And I know the question was about DNA testing, but 20 years ago we weren't talking to our patients about DNA testing because it wasn't really a thing, and likewise I think there are also things emerging that we won't be talking to our patients about today. So I do think we have that duty of care to our patients to give them that opportunity to, it's not just about telling them about it, but giving them the opportunity to explore what the meaning or potential meanings are.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Chair.
David. I had a question about a group of people and individuals kind of post-screening that Dr. Sarris alluded to and talked about just moments ago, and that's the group of people that have an unknown medical issue or ailment that they discover at the screening process. Do all clinics have to give them counselling and access to counselling post that information being disclosed to any patients?
No, they have to offer that counselling. And with genetics, it's genetic counsellor, isn't it, as well?
They do have to
offer.
They do have to offer it. How is that assessed in terms of success and suitability and appropriateness? Because I imagine that actually would be a really difficult situation for many people to be in.
From a counselling perspective, and I don't know about from yours, I suppose, because sometimes when it is a genetic condition, they may not even reach the counselling service within a clinic setting, because it's then potentially referred to genetic counselling to kind of go through what the genetic implications are for them as individuals.
And is that followed up by any of the clinics to ensure that actually happens?
It's probably not very helpful for you.
Just so I can understand the question and answer the correct question, you're talking about when a donor finds that they have a genetic condition and they have it already donated?
During the screening process, yeah.
During the screening process.
Yeah.
I think this falls under the remit of good medical practice rather than counselling. I think one of the problems in the Act is that the word counselling has multiple meanings. So the specific areas, and it is mandated within the code of practice that, of course, if something unexpected is found and you can't therefore treat somebody as a donor because that will preclude them, then you have to have a discussion about the meaning and the rest. But I also want to stress that's good medical practice, and if good medical practice is not followed, the issue is not the HFA Act, is actually a medical practice. And I'm not going to make any excuses for bad doctors. There are plenty around in many areas, like there are a lot of good doctors, and I think that's a different level of regulation. What should happen in a well-run clinic is, of course, you have all the discussions and you offer follow-on care, because the follow-on care is not necessarily there and then. This is a screening, they don't have a problem. Saying, for a good example is you're found to be a carrier of cystic fibrosis, What does that mean for you and the children? That's where the genetic counsellors come into it. Do you want other members of the family to know? That's a general discussion that is best placed to be had within geneticist sort of background, because also they have the expertise. It's also inappropriate for clinicians and medical teams that don't have an expertise in an area to take over that expertise. Their responsibility is to inform, to make sure that you've safety netted whatever situation is happening there, and to refer appropriately. And that's good practice rather than just what happens on the level of the counselling. If it doesn't happen, then it's not just a fertility issue, it's a doctor issue as well that should be following through.
Thank you very much. Christine and then Rebecca.
Sorry, can I just add to that? Just to kind of say, so like if there is a genetic condition discovered and referral to a genetic counsellor who can go through the genetic implications, clinics ordinarily would also refer to the counsellor for support therapeutic counselling for the how that diagnosis is impacting them rather than the medical genetic element of that.
How quickly would that happen? Is there a long wait list?
Well, unfortunately, the NHS waiting list for genetic counselling can be up to a year, and that
up to a year.
It can be longer in some cases. Depends where in the country you are. That is a general issue of funding about this particular area, and it will become more and more, just to put out, because the genetics is more and more being understood, and more people are going and having over-the-counter carrier screenings that you can screen for 1,000 things. the era of genetics is here. We haven't caught up with it, not just regulation-wise, but also policy and funding-wise as well.
And also for those that are freezing their eggs, should there be mandatory counselling for them? Either of you.
Oh, sorry.
I don't want to hog it. I don't want to hog the microphone.
And again, yes, routine part of the pathway mandated. So again, people are aware. And again, not that counsellors are medical experts in terms of health risks or medical risks, but that exploration of what those risks are for them, and also patients' expectations as well of the number of eggs required. 15 eggs doesn't mean 15 babies, which a lot of patients, despite having the information, might still believe. But I think as well, because of the different reasons that people freeze their eggs, yes, some are social reasons, sometimes it's medical, such as oncology, and also what we've seen an increase over the past years is gender dysphoria as well, so people freezing due to gender dysphoria. But again, the potential implications of that in the future. So yes.
Could I add, because probably the only thing we slightly disagree with. I totally agree, by the way, that I think that for donors and for recipients for that matter, counselling, implication counselling should be done. I don't think it should just be offered. But that's my personal opinion, and I agree with that 100%. And I wouldn't ever accept personally somebody become a donor or the other way around to be recipient if they haven't had that. And if they don't, then you explore why they don't. That in itself is a red flag. But talking specifically about egg freezing, and I can come from experience to explain this, I don't think that it should be mandated. It should be offered like any other treatment, because it can also come across very patronizing in many ways. So we actually in my clinic used to have mandated for egg freezing. We had a lot of complaints from women that which we mandated. So of course then we said it should be offered. It's not mandated, but of course it's available. I think there's a difference between women or anyone, men or anyone having fertility treatment requiring counselling for the treatment in general, which of course is available and should be available to everyone, even if they don't pick it on. But I think specifically for egg freezing, what is more important is not the counselling, but is the information that is given by the clinicians and the clinic and whoever else is about the success rates. And I do very much believe that to be the case, and I don't think that any bad practice should be condoned in any way. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't guarantee 15 babies with 15 eggs. You need 1 egg for 1 baby, or you can have 100 and have 0. Statistics, unfortunately, and this is the problem for any fertility treatment, statistics work on populations, not individuals. If I give to somebody a 10%, a 15%, a 50%, for them it's binary. It either does, you have a baby, or it doesn't. It's 0 or 100%, and everything in between. So though there are guides to understand it will, it won't, I've given statistics to people 1 in 300, trying to dissuade them, and they had the baby. But I had the 299 that didn't. I've given statistics of 85% that didn't have the baby. It's binary. That's the problem with statistics. It doesn't work on individuals. So you need proper medical information. That is medical information. If it's not given, it's wrong by the clinician who's doing it, and it should be done properly. I don't think necessarily that it mandates to see a counsellor to discuss about it if they don't want to. And that's my opinion of it, I think.
Yes, I think that you're absolutely right on that. The statistics is about the individual, and as somebody who's had fertility issues, you will take any odds at some stages. And if you said to anybody you have a 1 in 300 chance of winning the lottery, you'd take those odds. And if your lottery win is a baby and a child at the end of it, then you take those odds. Thank you. I'm going to go to Christine and then to Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Ippokratis, can I ask you first of all, what impact does the current level of compensation have on donor recruitment, do you think?
Well, I will have to admit that there are a lot of more learned people that have looked at that, including this room for the previous, so I don't want to assume. I do agree with what I heard, that for some people £985 is a lot of money, and saying otherwise would be patronising as well. Although, from all the data that I have read, the majority do not seem to be doing it, in this country at least, for the money. I am sure there are lived experiences where these are exceptions. I don't think I have enough experience and information to be able to give sweeping comments, apart from the fact that everything that I've read seems to not point to an exploitative practice based on just that particular sort of amount. The HFEA has looked at it at various points, done 3 reviews with public consultations about the money, so it's not just an opinion of one, and the HFE has put in their report to you all the information. I'm not going to go over it, and it seemed to me that was very sensible and learned. So I would agree that the principle of paying for gametes, or blood for that matter, or organs, is not acceptable. I think it's also not acceptable to assume that people should be out of pocket. I think that level is there. I think we got it right in this country. If it's 985, if it's 750, I think that's a debate that can be had, and you'll have arguments on both sides. I don't personally feel that the majority of people would be donating for that money. From my experience, I'm sure there are a few. It is a very arduous, as you've heard from the previous panel as well, journey to be done. I agree that, if you have on a, all the complications on an advert, yes, but it's not like, you go buy over-the-counter paracetamol and you don't know about it. You go to it takes months from entering a clinic to leaving, and multiple touch points. If a clinic is run properly and the medicine is run properly, then that shouldn't be an issue. Now, if that's not done properly, there are already regulatory steps and frameworks to make that go away. So then it's about policing, therefore, not about necessarily needing to change the framework. And that obviously then is a slightly different sort of discussion. So I think this country's got it right. There are others that I don't agree with, commercialization. I agree with that. But that's my opinion, and from the evidence I've seen. But as I said, you've had a lot more sort of learned people around that have possibly better opinions than mine.
So was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Again, this is just my own experience in practice as opposed to an overall experience of being counsellors. But, my own experience is that it's not the compensation that is motivating donors. I mean, obviously the compensation does sometimes come up in the counselling sessions because, and I think the previous panel had kind of shown that the research shows that it isn't predominantly the compensation that motivates donors to donate. And in fact, sometimes when I personally see potential donors, a lot of the time they don't even know compensation is available.
How do clinic staff screen, if they do screen for financial pressures, including with sort of egg sharing, etc.? And do you think it's done effectively at the moment?
So from my perspective, I think implications counselling is that perfect opportunity to kind of explore that, because we're exploring donors' motivations, including, any financial compensation, incentives, what their kind of status is, work, support, all of that. So we are kind of being aware of any kind of motivation for the financial aspect, and that's a good way in implications counselling, having that exploration for our donors.
Just on the implications of the donation, the amount of the donation, and whether it does actually make a difference. What's the evidence from Scotland on donor recruitment? Because there is no compensation offered in Scotland for donating. What does the evidence from there suggest, do you think?
I would need to defer to my Scottish colleagues, which there are some very excellent ones, because I do not have the full information. I don't want to mislead the panel on that one.
Angela, do you think there's any evidence from Scotland that can be gleaned from?
I don't know. Donors are still coming through, aren't they? Donors aren't compensated in Scotland. I can get back to you on current kind of how that's impacted recruitment and waiting times and such, but not off the top of my head.
If you could, that would be very useful. And just one last thing, you've touched on it already, the idea of it being very different, going through months of preparation and counselling for donation and going in and buying paracetamol. But just if you could lay out for us, how do clinics ensure that their marketing practices appropriately portray the physical and emotional implications of donating or freezing eggs?
So, first of all, obviously, I'm not here to excuse any bad advertising which is out there. I think it's very clear, the latest sort of Committee of Advertising Practice report in 2025 showed that 96.7% of our adverts are good, but that still leaves 3 and a bit, which is not good. And the fact that we keep on talking about the 2 or 3 which are bad means that they've done the job right and they should not be there. And actually, interesting, just to make a point, it's a very small sector. All of us are talking about those bad adverts. So the fact that it's there, we know what not to do, and of course you improve. So I think the specific ad, I do not think that obviously this should be pushing the happy sort of kind of compensation aspect of it. I think that is correct. That is bad advertising and it should not be there. I think most do not do that. I think having, but the place, my opinion is that the place of advertising is awareness, and that's where social media is. And there's a lot of it, and I heard I'll be interested to see that sort of post about the eggs sort of being hacked. I'll be surprised if that's from a clinic. If it is, that should not be there. But you can't legislate, again, influencers putting all sorts of stuff. I said the paper that we published last year was about generally fertility information, and it's amazing how much is just from non-experts and how much is lived experiences and everything, and that it floods pretty much the good practice. So I think it should be about awareness. It should be about advertising per se. And then if you have awareness and you're interested and intrigued, the place to have the in-detail discussions then are in the clinics. There's a lot of good information out there. The HFEA website has good information. There's some good clinic information. And also, there is no reason why that cannot be expanded as well. So I think it's awareness. I don't think that adverts necessarily should be there to sell egg donation as a product. And I think that's a fairly sort of, innocuous sort of belief.
Angela, did you want to add anything to that?
I guess I was thinking about this, and I think it's quite difficult to, how do you advertise kind of the psychosocial impacts? How do you get that into an advert? I'm not saying, by the way, that the adverts that are out there are right, and I agree with them, but I think it's very difficult in some ways about how you get across the psychosocial aspects of being a donor in an advert. But I think there could at least be a line in a lot of these adverts about the psychosocial. And I was looking at some of the adverts, and again, there is that kind of do something incredible, give a gift type thing, and the kind of psychosocial aspects. But there could definitely be a line. They could be improved.
You're thinking just something that would say, please be aware that there are psychosocial implications before you consider whether that sort of thing?
I know, like examples of impact or things for them to think about. I thought of something very good earlier, but I've forgotten now.
Right? You can write to us. I should have said at the beginning, if there's anything that you think when you stand up or I say order at the end of this, and you think I should have said this, or we should have heard something else from you, please follow it up with an email afterwards, because I don't want you to be kicking yourself when you leave this place, okay?
I guess my question, sorry if I can just add there, would be that, it's general about advertising standards. Is not, again, just about egg donation, egg freezing or whatever. I see all sorts of adverts there about sugary drinks and stuff. Doesn't have a thing, this candy bar can cause diabetes, early death, obesity and stuff like that. It's through public messaging that we know too much sugar is bad for you. So I don't necessarily think, unless you want to go down the T&Cs, which no one reads on the radio sometimes. I can't even hear them because they're so quick and whatever. Is that really effective either? I don't know. I think public messaging is better. And there are good organizations, of course, going to plug the BFS, but also the RCOG and the HFEA that can possibly do that and actually do some work with potentially with the social media giants, which I'm sure it's very difficult to do, to actually try to plug good information and not flood everyone with bad information, and there's some work hopefully being done there as well. So I think that's really the path over there, rather than having an extra sort of this will lead to long-term whatever it is. I think that's not the place to be. I think that should come from the clinics. The rest is just awareness of this is an option. Come and speak to a specialist about it, sort of kind of thing.
I was only going to ask, would I be right in taking from what you say that there is a public awareness and an availability aspect to this, which is different from advertising a product? It's about putting women who might want to donate for whatever reason together with the facilities, which is a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very big believer that medicine is not a commodity. It's not something that, and this goes for all of medicine. It's about awareness of conditions, and then obviously through that, try to do it properly. I mean, if we want to be bold, right, let's talk about boldness here. There could be a national egg bank, like there's a national blood bank or a national sperm bank, properly funded, properly done with not just regulatory oversight, but actually with all the ethical frameworks. You take it away from organizations which are private, then you can access to it for whatever ways people want to, maybe not just for NHS treatment, but also for private treatment, and they will have to contribute to that. There can be bold ideas that can do that. So I don't think the need, I think what I was trying to say is that the need is there, unless we can start creating eggs out of skin cells, which people are trying to, and when that one day, if it's possible and legal, maybe that will all be gone, egg freezing and the rest. But until that day, the need is there. If when we start closing the net too much, then we push people into countries that have less regulation and have many more issues there, which I can bore you with, but this is not the time and the place, I guess. Or to go into sort of underground routes. And we've seen that, for example, with sperm donors, where people completely bypass the regulations and just go and do it from the internet and the rest. So if we believe that this is something, and we don't believe it should be banned, but we believe it is something which is worthwhile doing and there's an altruistic pathway to doing it, then there is a boldness to say it will be centrally done. And it could be part funded by private equity or private sort of clinics and stuff like that, which are using it for their patients, and it can be almost a cost neutral. Now, this is just an idea, but we can be bold, I think, as well, when we look at these problems.
Thank you. I like bold.
Thank you very much, Christine. Rebecca, you've got a follow-up on this, and then questions on private equity.
Yeah, just briefly, because I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I think going back to what you said on advertising, you sort of made the point, well, actually, you've got to remember that there's a whole process that comes, and you do go through in detail all these risks, which makes a lot of sense. And then I'm just thinking through the theoretical arguments there then, really, because obviously take surrogacy, for example. So you cannot advertise surrogacy, but obviously you can go ahead with it, and you would go through the process and understand the risks, I would imagine, if you go through a clinic. So what's the differentiation for you there? Why are you comfortable that we've got a different approach? Which one do you think is right?
Well, I think that feeds into the previous a comment that I said about being bold and maybe taking it away from sort of more commercial setting and have it a more sort of centralized. And through that, you can say that it's about awareness and about advertising. And surrogacy, yes, you can't advertise, but of course there are charities and agencies which sort of help sort of to people to meet in some sort of way. And there was actually Law Commission sort of a recommendation about regulating that space a bit more and having licenses and the rest, which unfortunately never came through. So, but I had a look at it and spoke to the people that were looking at it, and that was very interesting. So I think there could be an element of, and that's why I call it an awareness piece. I don't think you should ever advertise for body products, let's say this, and we don't advertise for bone marrow or anything, but there is an awareness that you can be an organ donor, you can be a blood donor, and then the ways of doing it. Okay, fair enough, those currently in the UK are all on sort of through the government sort of funding, so unless the government is, and there's an appetite to fund also egg donation and sperm donation, I'll put it that as well together to the same extent, then there could be sort of those sort of frameworks. But I think what is advertising, which is what is awareness, it can be a little bit of a grey area, and that's where the regulators, plural, come in to say, actually, this is not good practice. That is good practice. And I think that's where it can be strengthened rather than an outright ban of per se, because then you can't ban social media as well. You can make sure it's got good, proper information and it's not misrepresented.
There are days that I'd like to, Dr. Sarris.
I think you make a really good point on blood donation. So we're all very aware of how to do that, but no one is advertising to me on Facebook, which shows you there are potential ways to do this. Okay. Do you want me to move on to the next section, Chair? Is that okay?
Thank you.
So I wanted to move on to the financial side, really. So we heard earlier that in 2030 the fertility sort of market in the UK is estimated to be worth sort of 1.1 billion. Do you have any feel for how that breaks down? And I appreciate it's quite difficult to break it down between, egg donation and IVF, because sometimes these things are linked. But do you have a feel for sort of where egg donation and egg freezing sort of comparatively sits within the market, as it were?
So I think we can dissect some of that number indirectly from the HFEA sort of data that we have already. So first of all, there are very, very few egg donation cycles compared to the number of IVF cycles. So I think in itself it's relatively small. Actually, what is not captured very well, because we don't have methods of doing it, it's all this cross-border medicine. So a very big proportion of UK people that require donation, especially egg donation, go overseas. And that is something, unfortunately, we don't have numbers because we can't capture it. It's not captured with the HFEA, it's not captured by the clinics, and it's not captured, potentially, it might be, this is where the linkage comes from hospitals where people give birth. So, but in the UK, just to answer that question, I think it's a relatively small area because also there's a small number of treatments. Egg freezing, again, is a small proportion of the overall treatments, but it is increasing. And it will only go up, in my opinion, as young people become more and more aware of fertility and fertility decline, because that is something just quite new. Not everyone knows and understands fertility decline, and I hear quite a lot, and actually I was of that generation when I was a teenager growing up. It's all about how you don't get pregnant. Either you don't get pregnant or you get somebody pregnant. It's all about contraception, which is a fantastic and empowering sort of discussion, but there's no then follow-on. But also, it then becomes more difficult. And it's not just female fertility, it's also male that drops, but of course a slightly different, very different slope. So as people become more and more aware, they understand, okay, what are my options? You can't push people into having children when they don't want to, when they're not ready. So what other option do I have? It's an imperfect solution, far from being perfect, but it's the only current sort of solution. So as people become more aware, I think it will choose. And whatever regulation we ban or not, people talk to people. And most people that I see want to come for egg freezers because a friend did it and they told them to do it and whatever, and some social influencer.
What I'm really trying to get at here really is just sort of understanding how much money there is to be made in this by the private sector. And so if we look at the numbers, so we know women are being paid £985, and then fertility clinics are selling, say, 6 eggs, that could be one round of eggs, couldn't it, effectively, for £5,000 upwards, right? Might even be more than £10,000. So that's a massive margin, isn't it? Are there costs in there that I'm not taking into account? I mean, that's
yes.
5,000. That's an 80% gross margin. That's huge.
There is a lot of cost in healthcare. I mean, just hands up, my clinic, we don't have an egg bank or anything like that, so I don't do that, but I understand the numbers nonetheless. When it comes to I think healthcare in general is expensive. The difference about fertility is one of the very few things in this country that we pay predominantly out of pocket. There's a data about 70% of treatments are from the private sector. And there's a huge cost because of technology, because of people, because of overheads. One can argue what is an ethical margin in business in general, and there'll be different models and different clinics, and there's the NHS as well that also treats privately patients. So it has to be understood that a lot of the private cycles are done within NHS organisation, and money goes back to the NHS as well. So not just private clinics that do private treatments. So there is, though, a lot of cost, and I think when you break it down, that is where the cost comes to the treatment. Now, it is true that there's a huge variation of what clinics will charge, and that is something that the HFEA and the CMA have looked at, and I do not agree with overcharging for anything. It doesn't have to be IVF, it can be a bottle of water. Again, that's my stance. People will have a different opinion. When it comes down to the amount of money that can be made, though, just to come back to that, inherently there are very, very few egg donation cycles with UK donors. Caveat that. And we can see from the HFEA that only 1,500 donors in general every year for the past 20 years have a cycle of donation. So that's not increasing over time. What is increasing and is happening is the availability of being able to import donors from overseas clinics. I'm sure something you're aware of because I've seen it sort of mentioned. And that's because there's a need rather than because UK clinics make money from it. If anything, it's the overseas clinic that make money. That comes back to the demand that is required, how you can do it more ethical in the country. The fertility area will only increase, just in general, just to move away just from the egg donation, just to make it a bit more general, because fewer and fewer people are having children younger. We know about the average age in the UK of women having children is 30. The average age of having treatment is 35. The average age of children per woman is dropped to 1.44. And that is a demographic that is not going to change. And a lot of people just don't want children early on.
Yeah, no,
so fertility will be required.
I think the point I'm really trying to focus on the financial here. So I totally understand all of that, and I understand why there's a market for it. But the point I'm trying to make is, are fertility clinics making a huge amount of money out of this? And if that is the case, you can see that we do have to be really careful here, because those eggs are desirable in terms of making money, and it's about getting the balance right. So fertility clinics are making a lot of money out of egg donation. Is that
generally
fair?
I think no. I think in general that some might. I think I want to caveat it. Some might, the ones that have big donation programs and might overcharge. Of course, there's 100-something fertility units in the UK. They're not all equally financially viable or successful. There will be the exceptions. I think that is not something that, as an individual doctor, I can. I'm not a clinic owner, by the way, so I'm just to say that as an individual doctor, I can comment too much. But that's. I think if you believe as legislators that you can curb not just for fertility, but also for any private medical care, whether that be a cataract operation, a thyroid operation, whatever, there is a limit to what people should and should not have, and have price caps, for example. That is a discussion that you can have on a national level about most things.
It's different, isn't it? Because someone having a cataract operation, that doesn't rely on someone else selling part of their body. So I think that's why it's a slightly different argument. But I appreciate time, so I'm going to move on because I've probably I think that was very helpful. But I just wanted, the last question is just around, I'm a little bit worried about, we focus a huge amount on the impact on donors, which is absolutely right. But I think someone said earlier about the importance of centering children, which I think is a very good point. What controls and processes do we have in place? So, for example, in a fertility clinic, if a man shows up, has a surrogate, wants to purchase an egg that someone has donated in good faith, effectively, how do you make sure that that is going to be a good family, a healthy environment for that future child? Do you do any checks? Is there anything in place?
Do you want to do the medical side or the initial side? Yeah.
I can say some bits, and I'm sure you have more interesting things to say. So it is written in the Act of Parliament that there is a welfare of the child assessment that you have to do, and that's for any fertility treatment, may that be surrogacy, may that be donation, may that be same-sex or different sex sort of relationship. So that's written in. I'll come to that in a moment about how that's done and what. I think with regard to the specific example that you made, I don't think it's for me as a clinician or as a doctor to tell you if that particular example should or should not go ahead. I think you as the legislators decided that a single person can do surrogacy as a single man as well. So I think that question has clearly been asked by people who've changed the Act of Parliament. So as a doctor, I only do what's lawful or not.
Sorry, the point I'm just asking is there anything in the law around that? So, for example, a convicted paedophile comes to you, wants to buy an egg, we have controls in place around that.
There is. It's called the Welfare of the Child Assessment. So you have to ensure. Now, we can all argue, who am I or you or anyone that can assess if somebody can be a good parent or not. I think that's...
I would argue a convicted paedophile wouldn't...
But I totally agree with you, because those are probably the very few exceptions where I think we can all agree that you should not be doing it. And actually, I think and we've had cases in our clinic, of course I can't breach confidentiality, where we sat in, because there is I just want to become sort of too practical, there is a form and you need to sort of assess, and they need to self-declare stuff, and you if there's any concerns, you go to the GP, you get more information, and then or other areas where you need information, social services, or whatever, and you put it all, and it's a legal requirement, and we have, and people around the country, I'm sure, has done the same, declined to treat people based on that. I think the issue, personally, is not when you have the two extremes, the obvious one that we don't, and clinics should not. And if there's a problem, the law, I'm sure, I don't know of an next case, but they can come back and look at why you treat it. So that is definitely happens. Then you have the other one extreme, where of course there's no issues whatsoever. I think the grey area, like most things in life, is when you have that in the middle. And where does it? And I'll give you a good example. And I'm not trying to shame anything or anyone, but I'll give you a good example, and maybe you can ask me what you would do if you have a well-controlled a patient that has schizophrenia but is well controlled in medication. They have good support, they have a good psychiatric sort of element around them, they have a good family. Should you or should you not treat? And these are real examples, and I just picked one because of the stigma that potentially but I'll give you another example of that, of other diseases where we don't stigmatize them as much, but potentially they have the same sort of implication, where you have, and we have these examples, you have a couple where you have one of the two had a heart transplant, and we know that if you have that, you have a lower life expectancy, so the likelihood is that child will end up with one child, yet we might have done egg freezing for medical reasons on the NHS, and now we're coming to use, and they're in a same-sex relationship, and you might use a donor sperm, for example. What's your assessment of that and the welfare of the child? These are everyday complex decisions, and I think extremes aside, which obviously you would always treat and not treat, there's always in the middle, and all doctors and everybody makes these assessments have their own opinions where they sit in that. But any time that you refuse somebody a treatment, it's never done on a one person refusing treatment. It's always done in a multidisciplinary approach. That's actually where the counselling becomes very, very important. We actually call the counsellor and say, we're worried about this, what do you think? Give us your opinion. I'm just a doctor, you have better understanding of people, what do you think? So it comes like that, and that is embedded within the law and the welfare of the child. The grey areas will always be grey, and we'll all disagree. Just two examples I gave you as to what do you think and where you stand on that. And I don't think that my opinion is any more valid than your opinion or anyone else's opinion, and that's why in these cases you have multiple opinions that come together. But yes, you would not treat a convicted paedophile as a surrogacy on their own. I think anybody who did probably is breaking the law with regards to that.
It's good to know that the law's there and you feel that that's being applied. Thank you so much for your patience.
No worries, thank you very much, and thank you both very much, and all of our witnesses for giving their evidence today and their viewpoints. It's really helpful in what is quite a complex area and one that has not been as explored as I think as other areas. So thank you very much. That brings this session to a close. Order.